All right, everybody, are we ready? Good morning, Matt. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
All right. Vicki, can we do the roll call, call the meeting to order?
Mr. Clausen.
Here.
Mr. Norris.
Here.
Here.
Schwartz.
Here.
Here. Mr. Clausen, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Absolutely. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okie dokie. We have a thin but good content. Only 4 things on our agenda today, but it's all good stuff with some good, robust discussion, I'm hoping. Also, I want to just start off and open by saying this October work session, we will not have a November work session. So this, ladies and gentlemen, sadly, will be our 2 board members' last work session, Mr. Clausen and Ms. Phillips. And I want to personally say thank you. You have definitely left D38 better than when you came on the board, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to work side by side and do the good work that it takes to run a school system. So thank you both so much. Your presence will be missed, and there's big shoes to fill. So, okay. Our first item is our consent task force recommendations. As everyone may or may not be aware, our task force we put this task force together, and it was a group of citizens, of parents, educators, students, community members who came together and wanted to find ways that we could make a difference with our students and in our schools, especially when some news came to light, and what can we do to be better and sharper and be more accountable. So this work, they've been meeting throughout the summer. A lot of work has gone into it, a lot of different viewpoints and ideas from all types of different individuals. And so they are here to talk to us today. We have Shelley Augustine and Amber Newberry, and then Amber Wetstein and Mr. Rick Frampton are going to be talking to us today about the progress and the recommendations from that work that has come out of that work. So.
Thank you. Good morning. I am honored to introduce Shelley Augustine and Amber Newberry, who have been our facilitators for the consent task force work that's occurred since about spring of this past school year. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction about the presentation, and then I am going to hand it over to both of them. Thank you, Ms. Upchurch. You set the stage well. This presentation aligns with priority 1 of our strategic plan, which is helping us ensure a safe, healthy, and welcoming school environment for our students. The purpose today is to provide you a summary of the consent task force work, and then they will share recommendations that came from the group over the summer. The 2 areas the group focused on are curriculum recommendations and then policy recommendations and revisions. It's important for our schools to incorporate teaching and training about the topic of consent to support our students and to ensure a safe learning environment while working closely with our parents and guardians as our partners in this process. A little bit of background about how this work came to be. Ms. Newberry approached me back in December of 2021. She is a parent in our community, and she also serves as a therapist. And she came to me with a concern that she had been seeing some young ladies who had been victims of sexual assault and wanted to offer her help in this area. And so we began a conversation, and then began the conversation with our principals and our school counselors between January and February of 2022. And then Ms. Newberry began to present to students both at Lewis Palmer High School and Lewis Palmer Middle School. And then we initiated a powerful Parent Safety Academy last spring, where parents came to learn about this topic of consent and how they could best speak with their children at home about the topic. That then spurred interest in a task force. And so from that Safety Academy, parents and students and staff volunteered to serve on a task force which began meeting in the spring and then wrapped up their work this fall. So they spent many hours meeting and discussing and debating, and excited for you to hear the recommendations that they came to consensus on today. Ms. Upchurch spoke to the membership. We had students, we had recent alumni, many parents and community members, school counselors, both high school principals. Mr. Frampton and I served as district liaisons, and then we also had 2 of our board members frequently at the meetings as well. Okay, pass it over to Ms. Newberry.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for seeing us. This has obviously been a labor of love for the last several years, and so I appreciate this time just to present to you what we have found and what we recommend. Obviously, we recognize that this is could be a sensitive topic for some people, so we do believe that an opt-out should be made available for parents who do not wish their children to take part in a consent discussion. We do believe, however, if a parent does opt their child out, that parent be given direct access to the materials being taught so that they can review those materials and that content with their children at home. And then the materials also include expectations and policies within a student handbook, making it very clear, very easy for them to access and acknowledge. We don't want just not understanding or not knowing to be an excuse for some sort of violation. In elementary school through 5th grade, the task force decided, the task force decided that the consent lessons could connect with anti-bullying and character education that's already in place. We believe that a language could be used consistently that lasts through elementary through high school. So when I've been teaching this last year, I've been using a stoplight metaphor that seems to go over really well and make a lot of sense for people. We would like to emphasize personal autonomy, peer pressure, self-advocacy, respect for self and others, and personal space in the elementary school arena when it comes to consent. So a lot of thinking about teachers allowing students to say how they want to be greeted in the morning. Do you want a high five? Do you want a hug? Do you want a fist bump? Do you just want to say hello? Those kinds of things as far as autonomy goes. There's also books and things that we could recommend and give as resources for elementary school teachers. The one I always mention is one that says, "All cats don't want to be held." For 6th grade, we do believe 6th grade is a time when you can up this conversation. It's a time when things are starting to happen. Kids are starting to roughhouse. Peer pressure is beginning. There needs to be conversations around boundaries. So we believe the 6th grade curriculum will build off of the kindergarten through 5th grade curriculum and include a discussion-based, so students are allowed to engage and ask questions, discussing peer pressure, boundaries, healthy friendships, personal values, social media and cell phone use, and add resources in that vein for parents, and talk about what safe to tell is and what happens when you call safe to tell. In middle school, In middle school, the 7th and 8th grade curriculum recommendations, we believe that should build off of the previous grade level, so building off of 6th grade, discussing sexual harassment, healthy relationships, power dynamics, substance use, informed and pressure, so information about what substance use does to one person, how you can say no to peer pressure when it comes to substance use. And then 9th and 10th grade curriculum recommendations build off of what they learned in middle school. Student-generated discussion on topics and questions that are submitted beforehand to be discussed as appropriate. Story-based learning scenarios, so having somebody who gives a engaging conversation, telling stories, how to give consent and accept consent, how to accept rejection, substance use, and consent around substance use. We found it to be really important to discuss nervous system responses, so fight, flight, and freeze. The idea that somebody might be in a position of freezing, so they might not be able to say no, and what that looks like. Mental health consequences of sexual assault and victim impact. Finding a trusted adult, how do you tell somebody if something has happened to you? Discussion around mandatory reporters and what that means if you talk to somebody in the school who is a mandatory reporter. Supporting a friend and being supported yourself while you support your friend. How to be an upstander versus a bystander. So how do you stand up for what's right if you hear something happening, if you know of something happening. Social media and digital consent. We believe that our resource officers are really important at this time. They are an integral part of our schools, and kids really know and trust them. So having the resource officers come in to discuss when we do consent curriculum, the laws and consequences of breaking these laws, knowing when you've been violated, specific information about reporting and filing charges, what your choices are, how you make a report, clarity of the process for the law and for the school. We do have an example that the task force, it's a real rough draft, but you would get the idea that there could be a flow chart that could be easily accessible. We talked about putting them in bathrooms so that students would know how to get help or codes so they could scan to get more information if they wanted to. The resource officer could also discuss consequences of retribution, timelines for reporting and evidence collection, age limits for being charged as an adult, and power issues related to sexual assault and violence, along with perpetrator stories. The task force did make note that they believe that the staff or the person delivering content needs to be qualified and trained appropriately. So school counselors, other mental health professionals, and the school resource officers, obviously. That is as far as the actual curriculum goes. Those were the ideas that put forth from our task force. And then next, Shelley is going to talk about kind of the policy and procedures that they discussed.
Of course, my role in the task force was to facilitate the read. So that meant that we had to read, which you'll see on the slide presentation. And so we are very appreciative that an effort that the members put in to actually review their policy, to each policy and provide input. So this first area covers policy recommendations to create greater clarity. We recommended that they provide title of the administrator responsible for the implementation of a policy at the top of the policy, and this will help people in the community, students, families know who to contact with questions. Lists the purpose of the policy at the beginning. For example, an example of that is on JICDE in paragraph 1. Policies should include consistent language, user-friendly language for ease of understanding and access. When referring to parents in the policy, we thought it would be appropriate to consistently use the term parent and guardian, as some grandparents or other people are in guardianship of their students. Next slide. Also, procedures and practices related to policies should be written within the policy or in an accompanying regulation for consistency of expectations and transparencies. And a good example of that is ACR2, how they list all of the procedures that should be happening under Title IX. Add the Title IX definition of sexual harassment in all applicable policy, procedure, codes of conducts, for example, JBB, bullying, student handbook, etc. Include a reference to the power dynamic Amber mentioned this a little bit, but we saw this consistently across both areas. And so we also had listed it as a needed place, probably in policy JBB, under the unwelcome sexual advances section. These policies address consistency in policies. And so policies should list, oh, hold on. Maybe we should go, oh, sorry, my fault. This second section covers recommendations to foster better communication. This information on this slide is indeed, also in the curriculum slides, but we just thought it was important to note that in this and other areas, each committee sort of had the same or similar recommendations, which are again placing materials for staff, students, and parents on a designated website. Policies should specify training for students, staff, and parents, and the number of times training will occur each year where applicable, and place all policies, procedures, and practices around Title IX on the designated website, and include other cross-reference policies such as harassment, student code of conduct, violent and aggressive behavior, etc. The next set of policies addresses consistency in policies, and we recommended that policies should list other remedies. Many policies already list this, but the verbiage is not consistent across the policy, so we recommend consistency, and the following policies, Title IX, bullying, violence, aggressive behavior, code of conduct should include verbiage around overlapping behaviors that include other policies. So again, we found that like bullying could be part of sexual harassment, so just letting people know that in those policies, and also students and families, that if, for instance, Title IX complaint is not found sexual harassment, they do have another policy that they can utilize to go further. Review and make clear and consistent review and make clear and consistent in policies when and how law enforcement is involved in sexual harassment complaints, and how, if at all, implementation of Title IX is affected with regard to this district's requirements. So this is another thing we found, that a lot of people didn't understand how the district works with or alongside of law enforcement under particularly Title IX, and so we thought that it would be appropriate for to state something like law enforcement may run its own investigation alongside, and it does not hamper the district's requirements. And then the last two are reviewing what already exists in policy, so the cross-references of other policies and the legal references in policies, that they're updated and they're consistent of all needed cross-references. And in the legal references, we found that some of the, like Title 18 in Colorado, had been revised since, say, a policy had been revised, so we recommended that that be reviewed and our policies updated as needed. The following policy recommendations focus on creating future processes to better approach district policies. Recommend a policy review committee to review Board of Education policies on a scheduled basis, structured to include focus areas to draw participants who are knowledgeable, invested, and engaged in a specific area, and members should include parents, students, staff, and constituents. Recommend the policy committee participate in the review of the policy for SB 23296, and update the policies made by the recommendation of this committee as well. So that they can review those recommended updates. There's a federal Title IX revision due in October of this year, and the committee recommends, of course, considering that in updating any policies. I do have a few other things that, if we have a few minutes, that I would like to share. I provided a few specific policy recommendations that did not make it into the slides because we thought we wouldn't have time. These are just some of the more important policy-specific recommendations, and there's also a document that you all received that explains more policy recommendations and the reasoning for those. But just to touch on a few high notes, in ACR 2, we recommended the following things: to include reporting Title IX to the Board of Education. We had a long discussion about confidentiality and FERPA, and we know that the board is held to those things. And we felt that it was acceptable for the board and administration to find a timeline and a time frame in which to report Title IX to the board. Include Title IX coordinators' contact information. In ACR 2, there was a section that we asked be striked. The verbiage was delayed reporting often results in, and among other things, the loss of relevant evidence and faded unreliable memories, and our group felt that the other verbiage around that, this could be struck from that policy, and that the rest of the verbiage supported the intent of that section. Informal resolution process should be provided as an option to both parties of a complaint and not only be offered at the district's discretion, which is how the policy currently reads. So just to make that clear. Also consider verbiage that includes informing parents and guardians of the Title IX complaints, because that came up kind of towards in our last meeting. And I think that could be looked at in a very specific way. And extend the appeal deadline to 7 days, because we felt 3 days was a very short time to make a decision about appeal, just based on trauma-informed practices. And SB 23296, we just recommended that the district adopt a standalone policy rather than an embedded existing policy, and we understand that the CASB and any legal input will happen around that, so we understand that, but that was just a recommendation. And also to provide a physical copy of the policies to new students and parents, because it currently just says upon their request, and we felt that any new parents should be able to have that given to them when they enter our school district. On on ACE2 and E3, which are the forms that are used for bullying policy and for Title IX, our students recommended that we put the word confidential at the top of the policy, so that they felt like, you know, everything that they put in there was kept confidential, and also make the witness section optional to maybe share with the coordinator if they met with them, or an investigator, to share more about witnesses in a more private setting. And then the last one is JVB. One of the recommendations was to include the word forcibly submits under unwelcome sexual advances. The current policy just says submits, and so that was one of the more detailed recommendations. And then also in JVB, it doesn't actually name the form ACE3, it just says file the form. So we thought it would be good to name the form so they would know exactly what to be looking for. And then also include in that policy reporting Title IX to the Board of Education.
Yeah, and I guess I would just like to reiterate that the document that Shelley is referencing is attached to your board docs. And if you have a moment, I would highly recommend you take a peek at it. There's a lot of specificity on recommendations that we would like to consider in the future, and come up with a means in which we can start making amendments to policy as the timelines are appropriate for that. Because there's going to be changes in the law, we want to make sure we're doing it at the right time, because I don't think we want to be doing it twice within a short time period because of changes in the law. So. But one of the things that I guess I want to just add to this is, Shelley and I were sitting in the policy component of these meetings, and we had a couple students who joined us in this part of the process. And a real aha for me was the disconnect between policy and kids. And we spent a lot of time talking about how we bridge that gap so students have an understanding as appropriate to their age on what policy means to them and how it can be applied to them, especially if there's a violation and they need to do something about that. And one of the things we saw is a lot of crossover between curriculum, which is training and teaching of students, and clarity of policy, which you saw in Shelley's presentation, is how do we maintain some clarity so it's user-friendly for the people who are, at the end of the day, our greatest constituents of policy, which is our students. So that work I thought was tremendous. I just can't lift Shelley and her skills up high enough to the board as far as her attention to detail, and as you dig through that document that's attached, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I would agree with the student piece, because we found just asking the students that there were a lot of things we were like surprised they didn't know. Like they didn't even know there was a formal form to use to file a Title IX complaint. And just kind of seeing how they see things from their perspective, even like safe to tell. There was a lot of conversation about that, and they felt that it was useless or didn't do anything or nothing happened, but they don't understand like the FERPA privacy piece that comes into play, where you really can't say what you're doing for a student, you know, that maybe is disciplinary, or a staff member. That is all protected information, and so it feels like nothing's happening because you never hear anything. So we thought that was really important to let them understand the value of the tools that they have and to use them, and let the background process happen.
Yeah. Yeah, we also, I think, you have another document of the additional curriculum and training things that we sent to you as well. We have just some other recommendations that didn't fall specifically under curriculum that the task force wanted to recommend. We wanted to recommend that we consider options for victim empowerment when charges are not formally filed. So giving an option for victim impact statements or no contact orders. The discussion was around how most victims know their perpetrator and oftentimes go to school with them and have gone to school with them, and they're not comfortable filing charges. They're not comfortable having a big formal review. They're not comfortable doing that, but they're also not comfortable sitting who violated them. So what are the other options we can offer to victims besides big formal investigations so that they can feel safe in school? Prompt follow-up with complaints and clear communication with all participatory parties. We're asking for reactive support with victim resources, restorative practices, and resources for the families who are affected when victims do come forward. We are asking for proactive communication and resources made available in our community, i.e. those flow charts we were talking about in the bathrooms and public areas that include QR codes that lead directly to reporting forms. So, we'll pull up the flow chart in a minute. And then we also had recommendations for student leaders. When we talk about sexual violence or sexual assault, a lot of times there is a power, there's power that comes into play. And so we wanted to recommend that student leaders, i.e. athletes, student council members, should take part in promoting a culture of safety and well-being for all students at our schools. So we propose that student leaders have consent agreements in their signed code of conduct statements and get additional consent training to take place during their seasons and emphasize the power structures that take place around sexual violence. This is an example of the flow chart that we were talking about. The flow chart is basically, have you experienced something? What are your options? Do you want to file charges? What does it look like if you file charges? Who can you talk to? Where do you get help? Those kinds of things, and to have those really accessible throughout the school. And then we have staff training recommendations. We do believe that all staff should train twice annually at the beginning of each semester. There was an in-depth conversation about what the training could look like, and you'll find that on the additional paper that we gave you. But basically saying the first training should be very policy procedure driven, and the second training can have more to do with experiences. And so student stories, teacher stories, what are they experiencing, what's actually happening at our schools, and providing our staff with the resources that are really easily accessible and provide easy access to information and forms that are necessary for making reports. So making it very, very, very simple for our staff at our schools to follow the policy and the procedures to assist students who come to them with issues or problems. And then this is Shelley.
So the next slide is access to policies and procedures. Policies and procedures surrounding sexual assault should be easily accessible and clear to find on the district website under the safety tab. We are advocating for an entire page of the website, our website, easily and clearly marked on the homepage to be dedicated to these processes, including information and resources, easy reporting, clarity of the process, school and law enforcement protections that are available. So just making it easy for people to go there and find out, not just constituents and students, but also staff, because sometimes it's easy to just go to one place and find what you need to kind of remind yourself of steps and things that are supposed to be taken. And then the next slide is the timeline of the process. Of course, presentation to the board, here we are discussing this now and in the public forum. And then also in October, review the curriculum recommendations and establish a team for curriculum development and implementation. I assume here in between October and when all of the other policies come out, such as Title IX revision, that we'll look at review the recommendations made by this committee, review updated Title IX policies and CASB guidance, present policy revisions in January for first reading, and in February, present policy revisions for second reading, and in June of 2024 is the deadline for new policies per SB 23296.
And I'll add, what's not illustrated on this timeline is a process for adopting curriculum. So we would anticipate bringing any curriculum materials forward to you for approval at some point prior to the beginning of next school year. We do have resources in place currently, but we want to vet those and then also add resources, as Ms. Newberry mentioned, including children's literature books and other resources for teachers. We'll open it up for discussion.
So excellent presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you, Shelley and Amber, for facilitating all the work that has gone into this and all the different perspectives and thoughts, and really mindful of the importance of this work. So we appreciate it. Thank you so much. Board, team, any thoughts or input?
I'll be glad to start. First of all, thank you so much for all the effort. It's apparent how much effort went in, and I was glad to be at a few of the meetings. I'd say a lot of work was occurring at those meetings, and it's very evident now that with all the specificity of what you're recommending. Personally, as one board member, it's a little overwhelming. It's a lot, which is not good, bad, or other. It's just, and I appreciate seeing the timeline, given the state recommendations and whatnot. So, given what you just spoke to, we already have resources in place. When we go back to review resources and curriculum, are you thinking of replacing, or are you thinking of adding? Or or even the step prior to that, how are you approaching that process?
We are planning to continue to work with Amber Newberry as an expert in this area, and to convene a small group of professionals who would vet the materials that we already are using and determine where we may need additional materials. We also have several materials already in place at the elementary school that you all approved late last school year, and so we are planning to look at those resources and identify where these topics may be in the curriculum, so that we can call those out as areas that should be emphasized within those resources.
And then my second thought is along the lines of, I realize this is a bit of a convergence between Ms. Newberry, what you brought forward 2 years ago, and then a community conversation that was occurring over the last year. And I'm wondering, especially with the state legislation that's come up as well, so now we have kind of a trifecta. Are other districts doing this same process right now in terms of really looking at their policies, or is this, this seems to be a deeper dive? I just wanted to get some clarity on that.
Well, and I can answer that. I'm on a statewide Title IX committee in which many school districts are coming together. That's specific to policy, and so yes, the answer is we're all evaluating policy primarily because the law is requiring us to, with the new Senate bill and the changes to Title IX. I haven't heard from anybody in that committee that they're going that next step in which this committee went. So if someone else is doing that, I'm not aware of it.
Actually, I'd like to piggyback off of that. I can tell you with almost a great deal of certainty that we are the only district that I'm aware of that has a community-based task force that is looking at this so much more deeply than just changes or updates to policy and the application thereof. And that's not to take away from conversations that districts may be having about the application of changes to policy, but I think what makes this really unique for us and something that just speaks to the collaboration with our parents and our community is we're going to that next step, and I lift up parents and community, it's really students, because we're talking at a real level, for lack of a better term, so that there's a much clearer understanding of what our responsibility is as a system. But ultimately, this is not some dynamic that just happens to occur in our schools. I mean, this is something that occurs everywhere. And to be able to be leaders in that and to really take kind of local control to that next level to say, what are the experiences that we want for our kids? Yes, it's important to understand the rules and the obligations and so forth, but to really design or co-design curriculum and then to have community members, parents that are taking such an active role in that, I think it's kind of a model. Not that I'm suggesting we go out and market it that way, but I think there's a lot people can learn from as we're really leaning into each other and talking through this in ways that, and it's more than talk, right? It's how it's actually being implemented and how it's really living and breathing in each of our school communities and within our broader community. So I think there's a lot to be proud of in that respect.
And I would say in my work in different school districts across the state is that what you are doing here and having a task force and this conversation is just not something you see very often. And it's unfortunate because this topic specifically is very important. So I really do think you have set a standard and an expectation and a model that other districts could follow. And what I find is that it's when something like we saw happen this last year occurs in your district, or a voice of people come together, that you start to see a school district pay attention, make changes, because I think they genuinely care about their students. And so what I see is a lot of parents going directly to administration for a one-off fix. And I think that this is going to be more than a one-off fix. So we really appreciate that.
Great points.
Yeah, I think the comprehensive approach is to be highly commended. And I think the other component that shines through is the student involvement. And there have been students at every meeting that I've been at, and they have not just been listening, they've been participating and advocating. So I think that's really an important part of this process. The one other thing that comes to mind, and then I'll punt to my other board members, is that I think the communication piece is so, so important, that connection between policy and the students. And to hear a student sit in a group meeting to say they didn't know what safe to tell does. They knew the term safe to tell, but they didn't know what it could provide them. That's the communication piece that I think is so important, that I wouldn't want to get lost in any of the policy writing or whatnot. So.
Well, yeah, and that's a good point. That was a huge aha for me too. And one of the things I learned is when you value student confidentiality, which we do, and a safe to tell report comes in, we, under the umbrella of confidentiality, the person making the report may not know what happened. And then there's an assumption that nothing happened. So what we're trying to talk about, and one of the ahas for me, is to help educate students that something really does happen. We may not tell you what that is at the end of the day because we can't, but don't make that assumption that because you don't know doesn't mean something didn't happen. When I told that individual student that I see 100% of the safe to tells that come into the district, they were surprised by that. So that's part of the training is helping them understand that our principals see that, our law enforcement sees that, our security sees that, our administration sees that, and we do something with it. We just can't always tell you what that is. So that was really important feedback for us to receive.
And that you have, he explained to everybody at our table that there are requirements of him. Like, I have to respond within this amount of time, which we thought was really interesting as well, and important for students to understand that Rick has, a responsibility and he takes care of that responsibility.
This is incredible. I wish we would have done this something similar 8 years ago. So this is a significant step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
As far as students go, I'd like to, I taught I taught a consent class in the middle schools and in LP high school, and something that I think is fantastic and super interesting is the idea of allowing them to submit questions and things beforehand. And I think as we continue to do that, that we're going to get a view even more into what they understand and what they don't understand, and what's happening in their lives and what they need help around. I taught a street law class at LP last week, and we had really interesting, great conversations that came through. I'm teaching at LP for all the freshmen and sophomores next week, and I'm really looking forward to the confidential questions that they're submitting, because I think that will help inform us even more on what our curriculum can and should cover as far as what they're experiencing, and it can help it kind of grow, be a living curriculum, a living document, if you will, that changes our students as their student body changes and grows as well.
Did you have anything, Mr. Schwartz?
Yeah, so I'll also start out with a lot of gratitude for the quantity and quality of work that's been done here. This is hard, right? This is sensitive. It's non-academic. It's really tangential to the charter of a public school system. And it's part of our macro society, as Dr. Summers said. So by definition, complicated, hard, and pushing a rock uphill, yeah? So thank you for having the fortitude, and to the district folks for having the fortitude to actually dive in and try to make a difference. That's my preface. I have a couple macro questions, if you don't mind. And the macro questions are with full respect to given the magnitude of this challenge, that if we only impact one student a year and we avoid a life-changing event, it's likely worthwhile. So having said that, my first macro question, I have several if you don't mind. I'll only take about 4 hours, Tiffany.
You have about 10.
You have 10 hours. Did you know that?
Everybody settle in then. Was there any analysis done, at least at this juncture, of current state and desired state?
You know, we talked a little bit about once you start having this conversation, are you educating parents and students and staff that you may very well see a trend up, but what we're looking for is a trend down. And I think you saw a little bit of a trend up when this first came out into our community. And so what we hope is that we would see a trend down. And I think those are the numbers that, the district looks at in regards to complaints. I don't think we talked about that specifically here, but I think it's a good thing to do going forward. Is we talked a little bit about surveying students to get see what they get out of it, and also having that, tracking our numbers will be data for us to determine whether or not what we're currently implementing is working, and educating students, because we may get more complaints, but then we might find that the complaints were not maybe in the right space. Maybe they were a bullying situation. I mean, it'll help us to drive decision-making based on the data that comes out of it.
Do we have foundational baseline data to start with already? Yes or no question?
I would say we can always reference our existing discipline data, because most of the concerns that rise to the level in which I'm involved, at least in Title IX complaints, have discipline attached to it, and we have very solid data around the discipline. I think the more nuanced components to this is more anecdotal.
We do also initiate student surveys on an annual basis, and so we may be able to do some analysis of those in how students are feeling safe at school over time.
Okay.
I think you absolutely will see an increase, 100%.
Increase in
reporting. Yeah, I think you will see a drastic increase in reporting.
and I assume there is a skill. One of the things that when this particular issue came up last school year, there was lots of buzz, right? And lots of emotionally charged buzz. And it's an emotional issue for all of us, right? And was there any conversation about attempting to validate? One of the things one of the parents said, which I thought was smart, was
this is not about educating girls or ladies. It's about educating men and women and girls and boys together. So that was really, really well put. Conversely, we've seen in the national spotlight what false accusations that are driven through can do to somebody's life, as well as what a real event can do, right? Was there any conversation about that piece, about, I'm not going to use politically correct terms, but some method of validating so that when you go down this path,
So
That-
I would love to.
that it protects the
I would
potentially
love to
innocent?
talk to you about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough one, right?
No, yeah.
And it's probably
so
an art,
I would
not a
say
science.
It's the number one thing parents say to me is, well, what about false accusations, right? So if you look at the data statistically, somewhere between 2 and 10% of sexual assault allegations are ever proven false. In that same vein, only about 15% of sexual assault accusations ever follow through to any sort of consequence for the offender. So there's this huge wide berth in the middle there of being unable to say whether something happened or something didn't happen. It's very he said, she said. Sexual violence and sexual assault is is not something that takes place in public often. So when you're talking about, false accusations and the like, the truth is that a false accusation absolutely could happen, but that without evidence, consequences like being expelled from school or going to jail, those kinds of things, are not going to happen. You have to have evidence against you, and that's amazing and wonderful, and that's the way the world should work, that you have to be proven guilty in order to have a consequence. But there is this huge number of this huge area where we can't prove yes or no. And so what do we do in that instance? And for me, I think always offering help and support to somebody who's claiming to be victimized is what the right answer is. And so I don't think that there should be a consequence for somebody without any proof or any allegations or anything like that. But I do think offering, if somebody is saying, I was violated, I don't have any proof, I can't tell you, then I don't think that who violated them gets a consequence or who they're accusing gets a consequence. But I do think we can offer them a no contact order, or we can offer them the opportunity to write their victim impact statement and have that kept on their file for them, for their own sanity, for their own desire for healing, for those kinds of things. So yes, false accusations can happen. I think they should be talked about in the curriculum. I think they're listed in there as being talked about. I don't think they are, this big. I don't think they're the biggest thing in the room. I think a boy has a 1 in 6 chance of being sexually assaulted before he's 18, and a girl has a 1 in 4 chance of being sexually assaulted before she's 18. So our chances of believing somebody and being right are far greater than to poke holes in people.
And Title IX particularly supports giving supportive measures to anybody who makes a complaint. So when they're in that space of where are we going and what does this lead to, they already are given that right to the support that they need. And I think we have to also, we talked about this too even in our group, but that, perceived experience of an individual person and how that affects that person individually is something that we have to keep in mind in providing the supports and or accommodations in an academic setting so that they can access their education. It's an individual response, so we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and so, thank you. Ultimately, if somebody comes forward, they're feeling something, and it's highly disruptive, regardless of what did or didn't happen, right? And sometimes this is in the eye of the beholder anyways.
Well, and that's the beauty of this, Ron, is many of the challenges that we have to deal with from the discipline angle is a different interpretation of consent. And if you have two individuals with a different interpretation of the consent, it's fraught with problems. And that's where the disagreement on accusations occur.
Right.
The purpose and the beauty of this curriculum is if we can define consent the same way across our student body, that's going to alleviate so many concerns.
It makes a squishy issue closer to binary, right?
Yeah, and that's the
Yeah.
part that I think is going to be most beneficial. Is
So
both
both parties involved in the incident are going to have the same definition, there will be no incident.
So here's my next macro question then. And actually, if you don't mind, I want to just step back to something Ms. Newberry said, just so that the team here can have some kind of clarity on the figures you quoted. So you said that, was it 2 and 10%, up to 2 and 10% were, proven's a tough word, perceived as being false.
Yeah.
Were the other 90% proven or perceived as being true?
No. So only 15% ever follow through to any kind of consequence. or
Right, so
any
now
kind
we're
of
talking
jail
about a
time.
net 25%. So
Yeah.
it's important for us to put this in perspective, right?
So in law enforcement, I'm not in law enforcement, but I kind of married to one. So, that 2 to 10% statistic, what that has to be based on is in law enforcement, to clear the record, it has to be very specific about a fault. To be declared as false, it's very specific on how it's declared as false. What we're actually finding is that number of false reports might actually be, there might be smaller false reports because some law enforcement agencies may not know that if somebody that comes forward and decides to not be cooperative, that does not get filed in the statistic of false report. That gets filed under inconclusive, but it does not go under false report. False reporting is very specific on what qualifies as false reporting. But some of them may say, okay, well, you know, the person that reported won't cooperate, so we're just going to put that under there. So there's a lot of education that's going into that in law enforcement agencies as well. But it also means that 2 to 10% may be closer to 2 to 5% are false reports.
Okay, but thank you. Where I was trying to go with this is if up to 10% are false reports and up to 15% are validated to the way we can validate, then we have roughly 3/4 of them that are in this mushy middle. And they're still impactful events for humans, right? And they're disruptive to their lives, their families' lives, their friends' life around them, and our mission academically also, right? So for us to take action is a good thing. So my next macro question is, if the board wasn't here to assist in decision-making, does the district feel this is the right thing to do, the right time to do it, and ready to move forward?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Not only from a policy we have to angle, but just from a moral obligation angle.
Independent of the policies and the laws.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So that's important for us to consider, right?
I would say when I came to Amber, actually I came to Teresa first, and then Teresa gave me to Amber, but it was 2001. It was before all of the news and all of the things, and it was just girls I was seeing in my practice from our schools who were having these experiences, and I would tell you that I did not believe, they did not have the language to talk about what was happening to them, and I did not believe that the people hurting them necessarily understood what they were doing was hurting them, which is why I chose consent as the, that's why I pinpointed consent, I would say, as the problem would be that nobody, like, to Mark's point, like, nobody understood.
Right, the students who may be perceived
Yeah.
as perpetrators did not intentionally hurt others in their minds. And so we feel it's very important to teach all of our students how to be safe and respect each other.
Okay. Thank you.
One thing I have, Ron, you mentioned that this is tangential or, you know, alongside of what we usually do in public education, which I agree with. But to add on to that, I think that implementing this comprehensive of an approach, K through 12, is also going to set up our students who are going to the university level. I have a student who just went out of state. She was required to do an online training that was 90 minutes. When she got to orientation, It was a 2-hour in-person orientation to be at the university, in person on campus as an undergraduate. So I feel like this also will prepare our students who are going on to other things, and whether they're going into the corporate world or the university world or other realms. I think they're going to be even more well prepared. And in that same vein, students and people who are at ease in their environment are better able to learn ultimately. So I think it's all around
Great point.
good.
I agree, and I think there was a task force here in Colorado at the state level around higher education in Title IX, and one of the things that came out of that was training at the collegiate level. And so I think that, but we see a lot of like online, videos. There's not what we're creating here where students can give input or ask questions, confidentially so that they can learn more and we can understand what it is they don't know in their environment. So I think what the curriculum here is suggesting is great, but I do agree that it prepares students from Lewis Palmer School District to be more productive, better learners and graduates, 21st century graduates, and it prepares them for college because as we all know, there's so many things that go on in college that are distracting and even probably more problematic around Title IX, that when a student leaves Lewis Palmer, they're prepared to step into that environment in an educational realm at post-secondary.
Sure. And I just want to touch on one other finer point that you brought up in terms of, well, let me put it this way. I've seen Amber teach a class of students, co-ed, and you are so respectful and so, your purpose is to educate everybody in these sensitive situations, and it's done very, very professionally, never ever pointing at one demographic or another as to them being problematic or something. So it was beyond anything I had seen in an educational realm myself, and it's highly effective. And every student in that room, based on what I could see in their body language, was comfortable in the midst of a topic that can be very uncomfortable.
So ultimately then, if this proceeds through, it becomes part of the fabric of the district, right? It's part of the DNA of what we do, is to attempt to get clarity on consent across the student body. One of the things I was just curious of, and it may just be my ignorance on the subject, seemed to me when you were talking about the curriculum and inculcating it through the student body, it went to 10th grade. What about 11th and 12th?
We recommended that it go to 11th and 12th graders. The problem with 11th and 12th graders is getting them someplace, sometime all together. So the thing that's easy about freshmen and sophomores is that they all take study hall. And so it is easy to walk into a study hall class. And so I'm going to be there all week next week in all the study hall classes, and I will hit all the freshmen and all the sophomores. And they've been given the emails that their parents can opt them out of that. So if during study hall their parents don't want them to have the consent talk, they can go do whatever else, do their studies someplace else. But we just did it through 10th grade because that's easy. We did recommend that 11th and 12th graders receive a refresher on it. It just is hard to get them.
And the task force discussed continuing to ensure that 11th and 12th graders have the information that they need, but our hopes are that by the time they finish 10th grade, they will be well prepared to advocate and take care of themselves. We'll continue to provide them the materials and the resources after that in a consistent way.
So can I throw out a thought then? Yeah. If we choose to go forward with this type of a program, can we find a way to measure and see if at 11th grade, if they've absorbed and retained it? Because if they haven't, then maybe we should reconsider the method.
Well, and what I appreciate about this, to your point, is I attended several of the task force meetings as well, and the work that was coming together was it shows that we are, our parents especially that were engaged in it, that we are committed to putting our actions, our words to actions, that we're committed to accountability, and that we are committed to doing something, not just saying, how often do we hear, well, something should be done. So what does that look like? And so the fact that this whole group came together, and I really applauded the students and the parents as well, who really engaged and advocated for them, for their students, for our school system, for them as parents. And when you have so many different minds coming together in the same room, and then finding what are our common grounds and where can we really make a difference with our students. The flow chart is a great example that I really thought was the student handbook. How many students just sign the handbook and don't actually recognize what's in the handbook? Or parents, us as parents, I will admit I have done that myself, where I'm like, sign it and go. So that we need to be more mindful of ensuring that our staff, our students, and our parents really understand what their rights are, and what does this mean, and what does this look like. I liked that we had the goal to know how to report as a student, to know as a staff what the laws are and how to report, that our students understand what consent means given and what consent means received, and that we're supporting when a violation occurs, that we're supporting those students, and that we're also supporting due process and procedural justice, which is due process, that there is a due process to those that are accused, and that we're doing this and coming alongside the parents. I think that is so important, that we're coming alongside the parents in this, and that we're indeed, at the end of the day, being accountable and trying to make a difference with our system. And I haven't heard of any other school boards that are asking their districts to be engaged in this work the way we are, with the robustness that's going into this, to make an impact and make a difference for our students on all sides. So I just thank you so much, and I look forward to the work.
And I would say that and I say this about a lot of topics in education, particularly a lot in special education, and Rick and I have talked about it in regards to inclusion, but you know, when we start at the highest level and we do something like this, a task force that the board is involved in and your administration is involved in, and then you push it down from the top to all the way to the desk side, right? By making decisions like this and coming together on a topic like this, you create a culture at your leadership level that then everyone should be following, because we lead by example. And so when our board and our administration lead by example in this space, then you're going to set a culture of safety and hearing students and meeting their needs. And so I think that's a very important thing to be thinking about.
Thank you so much. Any last thoughts before we? There's still a lot of work to be done here. We're not done.
Right. I would say too that like consent is in the Colorado standards for education for K through 12 as well. So teaching consent is regulatory, and it is in the Colorado statute for what should be taught in schools. So what we're doing here is not just important and feels good and going to take care of our students and going to make sure that our students feel safe and taken care of and respected and heard, but it is also taking something that has already been recognized by the state of Colorado as a need and really doubling down on it and really, really pushing it forward and saying, yeah, we believe that too. And I think that's important.
And something I'd say that I experience personally in working in this group is that we have a diverse opinions and people in the community, right? But I felt like everybody felt heard in this process, and that we were able to get, you know, input from a vast array of people with different opinions and different input and different outlooks. And I think that's really important, that when we step into a public space with compassion and conviction, and we can hear each other, but we're compassionate and we're convicted about where we're all going in the same direction, that I think it was a good example of what we can do in our community and what we should be doing.
So I'm going to close with one final question. As we're continuing on with the policy matrix and the policies and the recommendations. Will the task force continue to meet so that parents are still a part of this process and students are still a part of this process? Or is the main focus of the main part of the work done and now it's time to put that work into action?
The purpose of the task force was to present recommendations to the board in these two areas of policy and curriculum. The work will continue. The input seeking will continue, but what that will look like will be slightly different than the task force itself. And so we do anticipate a smaller group working on curriculum development that has actual expertise in this topic, as well as age-appropriate curriculum development. And then we do anticipate continuing to get input on policy revisions through a variety of avenues. I'm not sure if Mr. Frampton wants to speak anything specific to that, but we do need to take a look at CASB recommendations as we roll out Senate Bill 23-296, and then consider how to continue to get input on those specific policy recommendations prior to bringing them forward to the board.
Good.
I
Okay.
think one of the recommendations around the policy piece was to have the current members of the current committee, as they choose to participate in the review of that, and then just kind of going forward. And I think one of the large recommendations was that Rick and I talked about, we thought was really important, is the setting up a committee for policy review going forward, and making that part of your
Excellent.
parent-student community engagement piece.
Well, thank you so much. And this task force wasn't a hand-picked, it was, this is when we're meeting, anybody and everybody show up and be respectful and really let's put our nose to the grindstone and make a difference for our kids. Thank you so much. Okay. All right, so we are going to move along to B2, which is the Colorado Association of School Boards. And thank you so much again. I cannot say thank you enough. Delegate Assembly. This shouldn't take long. This is just, you all have had a chance to review the CASB resolutions booklet. There are 3 resolutions that D38 will be presenting. The assembly is this weekend. I will be presenting our 3 resolutions, and I will be voting on all of the resolutions in the booklet. All school boards, all schools across the state of Colorado each school district gets 1 delegate. So as the D38 delegate, I'll be representing D38. But I was curious on if anybody had any thoughts, recommendations, or anything they wanted to discuss and dive deeper into. I also sit on the Legislative Resolutions Committee with CASB, so we reviewed these policies, or these resolutions. Every resolution that gets submitted does get voted on, but the Legislative Resolutions Committee has an opportunity to put a check mark and say, we are forwarding this resolution with favorable ratings. We believe it's a worthwhile resolution, and we'd like to see it implemented. These resolutions will then be a guidepost for CASB's lobbying work that is done throughout the year for the 2024 legislative session. We got a favorable rating with our local control of our budget. We got a favorable rating and on the consent for our resolution to eliminate the budget stabilization factor, and that's been a lot of work. We've been going into that. The feedback was, it is like, let's see the legislature and the governor put money where their mouth is. They said they were going to get rid of this. It's time, it's due, it's overdue, and let's do this. And when it's put on the consent, anything put on the consent can be, just like our board meetings, can be pulled off the consent and still debated. But this consent resolutions are typically voted on as a package. And then we had our local control of curriculum was forwarded with no opinion from the Legislative Resolutions Committee. The CASB Board of Directors has started taking some statements and some positions on some of the resolutions, and they did take a position of not support on our local control of curriculum. But for the last 3 years that we've done this, that our resolutions have always passed. So it looks like I will have a floor fight for at least one, but I will open it up for discussion or thoughts.
What does that mean when CASB doesn't support it?
I wish I could tell you because
that's
this is
always been
new.
nebulous
I've
to me.
never seen this. I saw it done last year. There was some resolutions put forward by a couple, a school board that its reasoning had some information in it that wasn't accurate, so they felt the need to set the record straight. So when the discussion has come up, the reason that has been given on why they don't support it is some school boards, some delegates have argued that they see it as a book ban, and so I've argued this is not a book ban. And their other argument that is made against it is 178 school districts. How do we ensure that every student across the state of Colorado is learning on the same level and learning the same material? What happens if a student moves from Yoder, Colorado to Harrison School District? How do we ensure that those students are on the same page? So those are the arguments against. The arguments for are the same strong arguments we make for why local control as dictated and, no, I'm not going to use the word dictated, that sounds bad, as set forth in the Colorado Constitution. But are there any other resolutions that you would like to discuss, or are we just ready to roll and move on to the next? Yes.
Mark, make it work.
It works.
Okay. It's a big document, but one that grabbed my attention is on page 45 of the document. It's resolution number 26 regarding BEST. And having just come off of 4 years serving on the BEST board, what I would say about this is while additional funding for capital is necessary, BEST needs some strategic vision. And so just putting additional money to BEST would not be a wise investment without actually making sure BEST has some strategic vision on how they would receive and work with the additional funding. And I say that again after 4 years serving on that board and still not being able to know what the strategic vision of the program is.
I'm just curious, who would provide that? Who should provide that?
Well,
because would it come from CASB? Would it come from?
No, it wouldn't come
BEST
from
board?
CASB. It would come ideally from the combination of legislative vision and the BEST board themselves.
Okay.
So that would be my suggestion, to provide some caution or hesitancy of just putting more money to the current program. Because the reason the current program is in the state that it is because the program is not being administered with any strategic vision. It's just spend whatever we can whenever we can.
It's interesting how the resolution language reads.
And it was put forth, who put it forth? Okay.
Because it sounds like more of a funding effort, even though,
It's totally about funding.
yeah,
Which means they just want to spend more.
yeah.
Well, and
Again, I tried for 4 years to get some structure and some good conversation, some good strategic conversation into that process and into that group, and was unfortunately unsuccessful in that.
May I ask a question? Why couldn't you or they get structure and definition of what good looks like, which is, I think, what you're really saying? What was missing?
I think what's missing is something to anchor to, and that's why when I'm talking about, like when we've spent all this time putting together our mission, vision, and values, and there's nothing like that. They started the race without even knowing where they're going, and they're just running down the road and throwing money here and there, and doing good things on the way. I'm certainly not going to say they haven't done good things, but it hasn't been pursued with real strategic intent.
And for our newest board member, Mr. Norris, so what BEST is the Building Excellent Schools today? It's a grant. Schools get grant funding through this. The marijuana money, when everybody says what happened to all the marijuana money, is an example. All those dollars go straight into the BEST grant program. They do not come back to the schools. They go, and then the schools have to apply for capital projects, for example, mostly capital projects, and then our school district has to match those funds if we were to actually, when and if we qualify for a grant, which we're usually able to get for boilers and roofs. Big projects, you don't see a school district like D38 being able to qualify for that grant money, and you also, the matching funds we don't have. But BEST program was actually created well before before that proposition passed. It's been around for a while, and correct me if I'm wrong, the dollars that BEST has available for schools is starting to run dry. Is that correct?
Yes. I did not, but we can get you a different one.
You've had enough, Brett.
Enough?
Timed out.
Isn't that the pot calling the kettle?
Absolutely.
Yes, the marijuana revenue is starting to really contract as additional states have been passing it. Colorado's not the destination that it used to be for people coming for that purpose, and so the revenue that comes from that has really started to consolidate it down to a kind of a basic level. Even when it was doing well and providing like $100 million a year into this program, you know, one of my favorite lines on this is there's like the exact number is like 420 or so high schools in the state of Colorado, and a high school costs $100 million. So as long as we wait, we could get a new high school every 400 years, right? That was my connection to it, and how basically ridiculous it was to rely on that as the source. So
That's the art of the practical.
yes, which there is, like I said, there hasn't been the practical or the strategic for that.
Question in a different vein.
Yes.
If I may.
See you over there.
Are you or anyone meeting with our lobbyist, Amy Atwood, and when are we, not necessarily me or Mr. Clausen, but when is the board receiving a update from her?
So we had talked about having her at this particular meeting. The legislative session starts in January. I actually just had that conversation of finding the meeting times on what does our advocacy work look like here in D38. So that she will be attending a board meeting either.
We haven't formalized the specific date yet, but it's going to be likely December.
I will say on an unrelated note to that is I have been working with Amy a lot over the course of the late summer, and we're having a bill drafted. This is after I ran into Senator Lundeen over here at Arlene's. I had a quick lunch conversation with him, and I said, "Hey, I've got an idea," and he said, "Great, let's get it to drafting." So Amy's very key in something like that, and so we've had a lot of conversations which she has helped facilitate, and so she is doing great work for us, and that could be part of that update.
Exactly, and I mean, if there's anything, and I know both Mr. Clausen and Mrs. Phillips, you may not have the opportunity to be there for that update, but if there's anything that you have in the way of questions or even advocacy, I mean, we're happy to set the table for that. But we do think it'll be a good opportunity for the new board to have that brief shortly after being sat.
But I think I'd like to invite Mr. Clausen and Ms. Phillips to join that meeting and sit in the audience for all 6 hours.
Is that a standing invitation or a sitting invitation?
They can sit.
Okay, that checks the box.
Just once.
Thank you for that input. Any other input? questions, comments? Going once, going twice? All right. Well, then I will be giving a report out after the delegate assembly, and we will also be voting at this is the fall regional meeting, and then there will also be a winter meeting that happens every year at the Broadmoor, where we will also be voting on delegate, bylaws and board of directors. So there's 3 open seats for board of directors in Region 6, which is what we are. So I'll keep you guys updated on that as well. All right, well, moving along to number 3, our policy matrix review. And this, we also talked about this during the consent task force as well, of when somebody wants to look at a policy and they want to have a conversation or reach out to staff, we have the matrix, but how do they know who to go to and who's responsible? So we also talked about putting the matrix on the board docs page of our district website. Not necessarily a name of a person, because I hope not, but Mr. Ridgway may not be, something might happen.
You get hit by a bus.
Right, I don't want you to get
Oh,
hit
boy.
by a bus.
Let's hope that doesn't happen.
My point is that it's more about the position than it is the person. So I'll let you guys take that away.
Yeah, the main thing we just wanted to elevate or re-elevate today is, and I'll take some accountability on not making a point to bring the matrix forward the last couple of work sessions. So we have an opportunity to just get that back on the tracks and use this tool, to your point, Ms. Upchurch, to not only be clear in what we're reviewing, when we're reviewing it, who is running point, so to speak, in that review process. But I think there's also an opportunity, and I hate to continue to bring up this board transition, but I think it's probably fitting that there's an opportunity with a refreshed board to refresh the way that we're going at policy review, revision, and what role our community can play in that recommendation process. Certainly you just saw an example from the earlier item with consent recommendations as to upcoming or impending policy review that will align to those various policies that were reviewed. Now that said, we haven't specifically identified those as of yet because there's just a lot of different moving parts to those and quite a bit of information that comes into focus, which is the other purpose of the matrix, is to simplify that as best we can and just really get it down to the core issues that are being addressed as that recommendation comes forth. And then what we are also envisioning, and it's not here yet, is just a summary column that explains here's what it is, but then also the intended impact. So I think that will help create or recreate a cadence that will not only assist the board in its work, but be very clear to the community. The only other thing I would add to this point is a reminder that at our last meeting, we did have a first reading for policy GDD around staff vacations and holidays. So at the October meeting, currently that is the only policy up for consideration and ultimate approval as part of a second reading. At this time, we do not currently have any policies that we're identifying for our first reading. That will likely change as we're going into either the November and or December meetings, and so that's something else just for us to make sure that we're on the same page with. And team, am I missing anything in that overview or that explanation, and or are there any questions that we can help respond to? I did that good of a job.
I applaud that this is a policy that this is good work. This is another idea. This is how we, Alicia, how you and your team are being creative in finding places and ways that we can improve as a system for our staff. And so this is a prime example of finding ways to be a better system for our staff.
And if I can just echo that, it is a great representation of the work that's being pursued within the business and HR functions of our system. It also represents, and I think this is a key critical component, where we receive direct feedback from our staff that we could incorporate into a revision. So similar to what we're talking about when there's parent or even student recommendations that are coming forth, just making that a function of, if you recall in policy BG, there's a process by which we can funnel those recommendations forward. And so we want to make sure, again, that that's a clearly understood, transparent vehicle that people can bring forth whatever recommendations or ideas they may have. Now that said, there may be times when we haven't run into a ton of this, but where there may be conflict or differences of opinion or, this point of view versus that point of view. Our job is to help filter that, so as the board is considering various directions in which way to pursue a policy, we want to make sure that we can articulate that in as clear of terms as possible and can really anticipate what both the intended or perhaps unintended consequences are. So I think we're strengthening our policy governance muscles, if you will, in that space. And then also, again, making it very accessible to our community so that they can feel a sense of ownership and connection to what we're doing when we're doing it.
I like that last statement, that connection and that ownership.
It's our community schools.
Our customers. Any other thoughts, feelings, questions, comments?
About the policy matrix?
Yes. Yes.
Feelings on the
No,
policy.
I don't want to know your feelings. Not today.
No, if you're asking for general
Yes.
other stuff, this is October count,
Okay.
right?
Can we pause?
Okay, I'm not gonna say it.
The only reason I'm asking that is to get to our last item,
Okay,
and we do have time,
okay,
but there's a lot that can funnel into that last item.
okay.
Our last item B4 is upcoming board meeting schedule.
Okay, so here's, before I turn it over to Brett, if I can, are you okay if I take the lead on
Yes,
some of
please
this,
do.
Ms. Upchurch? Okay, so the first thing I just want to refer to, and I apologize, I do not have this brought up on our current
Documents.
computer screen, but I'm just going to highlight a few things about what to expect on October 23rd, just as a starting point. And then I know there's more conversation to come around some upcoming meetings. So the draft October 23rd agenda, we are still working on finalizing which community and potential student recognition we will have for that meeting. So I won't go into a lot of detail on that. Ms. Wetstein, we noted that you had a couple of connections and we just need to update on that and we'll get them all squared away. But one thing that will be the first meeting for this to occur is the introduction and inclusion of our student representatives at our October meeting. So yesterday, both Mr. Schwartz and Ms. Phillips had the opportunity to meet with the Lewis Palmer Student Council, and then we have an upcoming meeting with the Palmer Ridge Student Council next Tuesday. And so we're setting the groundwork. I think the students really have a better sense of kind of where we are and where we're going. So we're excited about that. So that'll be an opportunity for them to be formally introduced, to provide an update. We actually have them listed as item B4 in the agenda. So that'll sandwich in between board member comment and the superintendent update. Which, as a quick side note, and I've shared this with Ms. Upchurch, but just so everyone's on the same page, I am actually going to be absent for the first time ever at a board meeting. Due to a personal family trip, I'm going to be out on the East Coast watching my daughter play some soccer. So Ms. Wetstein is going to be running the meeting from the superintendent seat. So we're excited for Amber to, you guys will probably let me know when I come back that you don't need me to do the job, or I don't know. I don't know what you're going to say. Amber's going to do great.
You're overstating the obvious, Dr.
Okay, well, I guess I didn't have to say that after all. So thank you for that. But we will be welcoming Monument Academy representatives and leadership to the October 23rd meeting. There will be an annual report that will be delivered by their Chief Operating Officer, Kim McClelland. I believe there may be a board member or two that is planning on coming. I think traditionally we have hosted a mini reception ahead of that board meeting. We are actually, a number of us from our executive team are going to be over there today. So we'll clarify exactly who we're thinking is going to be present, and then make sure that you guys know kind of what that will look like preceding the meeting and then into the meeting. So that's one of the main topics on the agenda. Something I want to mention that is a very strong possibility then to back up to that annual report. We have been engaged in some ongoing contract review and updating where we are with respect to a few different items built into the contract. The one item that is currently bubbling to the surface that I think it's been a while since we've really honed in and updated the contract to reflect changes is within the area of special education service. The short version of that right now is that we have been operating under a contract that refers to an insured model, which essentially gives us the responsibility of hiring staff, special education staff, that are working at Monument Academy to help serve special education students. That is not the model that we're actually operating with. So they have the ability to hire and staff their building according to the needs that students have that are receiving individualized education plan support, IEP support. So long story short, it's a very technical type of an update, but it is one because it would result in an amendment to the contract that would require the board's review and approval. So we would anticipate a strong draft of that preceding the October 23rd meeting. That being said, we are hard at work with our legal counsel and in continuous conversation with Monument Academy on that particular topic. So there's a small chance that that amendment or draft amendment is not ready by October 23rd. But if it is, we would like to have it on the agenda. We would like for you to be able to review and be able to ask any questions and ideally be able to approve it in that meeting. But we understand that's kind of a lot of processing that still has to happen. Mr. Schwartz.
Well, you alluded to, I think, an answer to my question. It there's financial and functional impact to this potentially, right? And so my question is there an opportunity for a first reading? And it sounds like there may not be.
Well, there is one. If you decide to take your time in reviewing it, we aren't necessarily trying to rush anything. But what I will tell you is that after multiple conversations that we've been engaged with Monument Academy on this particular issue, it's the way business is being done right now. There's not really a loss per se. It's just getting the language of the contract up to par with the way that things have been functioning for some time. So I don't know that there's a huge, for lack of a better term, risk involved. It's just clarity. And the clarity that I think we have is as the authorizer, as well as making sure that we're very clear about how does this actually operationalize. And I think just in an earlier conversation, if I can mention this, Ms. Upchurch, you even reflected, we get a lot of questions on this. So it may be an opportunity for us to also help educate the community at the same time to help them understand this is how it works. And it's not really anything wrong. It's just the way that things have evolved up to this point. And I would tell you that both from a Monument Academy perspective as well as our perspective, we're both good with it, but of course we want to make sure that our board is equipped with the right information to be able to make an informed decision. So I'm kind of reading the reactions. Ms. Phillips, do you have, not to point on you specifically, but okay, all right. And Rick, is there anything I'm missing as I say all that? I think that pretty much summarizes it, but there's a lot of things that are in the weeds too.
So
Yeah,
just so I'm clear.
Yes.
The procedures are just changing, but there won't be any additional cost to the district or to Monument Academy? Is that what I'm hearing?
It's essentially a wash because the way that we used to do it is there was a process for how Monument Academy is buying back services of the district. And there's no material disruption to how they would just fund their staffing model based on the total allocation of dollars per pupil that goes directly to Monument Academy. So for us, instead of coding special ed as a separate category, it would just be less of a buyback that we have to account for. Brett, did I say that accurately? Mostly?
Yeah, and they've been running as what they call a contract services model versus the insured model, right? They've been running on that way. We've been charging them that way. The contract just unfortunately wasn't really reading either of those. So we fine-tuned the chargeback already that we were delivering to them for the 22-23 results. And again, it wasn't a material change, just a little fine-tuning.
And since this is a negotiated contract, not a policy, if we do a second reading, we just vote on it, right?
It would not require a second reading unless you wanted just more time. If it didn't feel, for lack of a better term, have the right feeling right out of the gate, we could certainly postpone or delay the vote. We thought since they're here and since we have council working on it and since things seem to be moving in this direction, it's very, I would call it right now about 80, 90% plausible that we'll have a contract amendment that would be up for your consideration and ultimate approval if you so choose.
Do we need
Anything else you want to mention on that?
I'm wondering, I know we've been in discussions about their approved waivers. Is there anything that we need to mention about that?
So there is an opportunity to share with you all what information will be going forward to the state board as part of an updated process is probably the best way to say it in terms of what waivers they're currently working under and what waivers need some technical adjustment. So without going into all the weeds on that, there's really no local board action that's required in that. There is state board review of those waivers that we're pursuing as well. And Ms. Wetstein, that's another thing that we actually, matter of fact, well, you were in that meeting last week. We're going to talk with them again today about that. I think we're aiming for a late October state board review that would be items placed on their consent agenda. I think it's just more informational than anything. So a lot of good, I'll summarize it this way. There's been a lot of really good ongoing communication with Monument Academy leadership. I would anticipate this annual report to go a little bit deeper than perhaps the last couple of years in some ways that are also articulating their approach to, for example, their accreditation status and their accountability rating that they just received, as well as some other ways that they can demonstrate continuous improvement as a system. So I think Kim is prepared to do a lot of that and to do it in a way that's a good opportunity for her. I don't think she's formally been at a meeting yet. So this is a little bit, we do a fall update every year. It's a little bit later than maybe what we've had on the calendar previously.
I'll mention that we will bring forward the 3 unified improvement plans for approval at that meeting as well. Those are the 2 high schools and then Monument Academy Elementary School.
That's right. And the October count will be available at that meeting as well.
Yes, so that was the intent, is for a segue to occur with.
Before we go there, though, I want to make sure we cover November. But Mr. Clausen, in your time on the board, when we've gone through our annual review or when we've had to review our contracts with Monument Academy, you've been part of that process. Is there anything or advice or wisdom you can bestow upon us as an organization?
You know, Monument Academy is an organization that's part of this district, and I know when I first came on this board, they were treated kind of like the ugly redheaded stepchild. And I think we've made a lot of progress, but, you know, as far as interacting with them, I think we just do our due diligence, review the contract, meet with representatives, and just make sure that legally everything is binding, and we make them feel part of this community.
100% they are a part of this community. All of our D38 children, regardless of what school they go to, are our D38 Tri-Lakes children, students. Okay, before we do segue to October, Mr. Ridgway, November, do you want to cover that very quickly?
How long do you need?
Not very long.
Is there a number? Because I do. I want to make sure we have a good enough opportunity to talk about November. I just don't know how much detail you're trying to go into.
I'm not
right
trying to
now.
go into a lot of detail. I'm just
Okay.
saying here's some data that I
Are
have.
you okay if he just does that real quick, and then we can wrap it up with November and beyond?
Yep.
So in terms
you.
of, yes, at the October meeting, we'll have some information. It'll actually be pretty much this information that I'm providing you now, because the full details of the reconciliation of the October count really doesn't get hammered out until later in October, right around the beginning of November. So I just wanted to provide you some of this information. You know, we've been tracking it, as you know, throughout the course of the fall, being a little bit behind budget. We actually have had a little bit of improvement over the course of September, so we're not quite as far off of budget as we were. Right now, we're about 0.6% off of budget on the operated schools. Monument Academy does have a fairly sizable issue. They're almost 9% off of budget, so they're going to have to make some big changes on their budget for this year. And I guess that's about it. I'll just have copies here if you guys want to take a copy with you.
Excellent.
In addition to the enrollment update and anything else under financial planning and analysis, we'll also have an opportunity for the review of our Financial Transparency Committee membership. So that will be an item. Currently, it's sitting in Section C. It could go into consent if you prefer. And then the policy revision that we already mentioned. And that should do it for October. So I think that's essentially what we have in front of you for that upcoming October meeting.
Excellent. So it'll be only 4 hours for that meeting.
In that case, it's not long enough for Mr. Clausen or Ms. Phillips. We'll have to move you to December.
I'm kidding. We won't keep.
I was going to say something clever like, it depends on how many questions Mr. Schwartz has, but
Go ahead, we'll wait.
okay. All right.
November. So this is wanted to get a pulse on where everybody is on November. And the reason that November becomes tricky is we don't have a work session, because our work session would typically be on November 7th. That's election day. So we want to make sure everybody's out there voting, and not in here talking. So our regular scheduled board meeting was going to be November 27th. Mr. Clausen is out of town and unavailable for that date, and we definitely want to make sure that our outgoing board members have an opportunity to be a part, and so that we can celebrate with you. And then the other tricky part is when the election will be officially certified, when we have a timeline or a window to swear in our new board members. And Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Norris, you will also be re-sworn in. So you can rehearse. Make sure you write right hand, not your left hand. Okay. So anyway, I wanted to get a feel for everybody's availability.
So can I re-summarize real quick and make
Yes.
sure to add this piece? So I think in light of both Mr. Clausen's and Ms. Phillips' schedule, the feedback was that November 13th may be a good last meeting date. It also allows us to have any additional business that we may have to conduct prior to later in November, and in lieu of a work session in November, November 7th. So is the November 13th date something that can work for this group? And we're envisioning your families also joining us.
Evening,
It would be an evening
6
meeting.
p.m.
6 p.m. We would likely have other recognition in that meeting, but I think the bulk of the meeting would probably be recognition of you all. And then any other business that we have, like I said, that may just need the timeliness of that meeting to add to that agenda. So I think that was step one, was making sure that November 13th. Good to go. Mr. Norris.
My wife will be in Cambodia, so she won't be able to attend, but
And just to be clear, that 13th meeting would not be anything other than the outgoing board member recognition.
oh, okay. Yep.
So your swearing in, along with Mr. Schwartz and any new board member, would not occur until after Thanksgiving. And I think we're still targeting November 27th.
We were looking at, still looking at 27th. The county has to certify the final official abstract of votes no later than November 29th. So there is a potential that we could not be ready to swear in until our December meeting. So there will have to be some flexibility, because otherwise, maybe the 13th will be our only board meeting for November.
Correct.
So we just need to have some flexibility. We're kind of dependent on that. And then the other piece of it is that the Colorado Secretary of State is going to be conducting a statewide risk limited audit, which is in collaboration with the county prior to the official abstract of votes. So I do anticipate it may take a little longer, but once those votes are officially certified, we have 10 days, I believe it's 10 days to swear in our new board members. So, so it's kind of one of those tentative but standby board meeting dates.
And technical question. How long are Mr. Clausen and I serving until the new board members are sworn in?
That is correct.
Okay.
Not off the hook yet.
April 2024 is a good date.
We could swear them in, just kind of an informal, then we could have a board meeting and kind of do it publicly. So that is an option available.
That's a good idea, yep.
So it might be helpful, and I'm just, oh, sorry, Vicki, I'm like talking to you. It might be helpful to, as we're communicating this, solidify November 13th, solidify the fact that we do not have a work session, which I think is already communicated. November 13th is our official November board meeting, and our agenda will be mostly focused on what we just discussed. And then put tentative on November 27th in the event that we may have to postpone November 27th for an alternate date.
Am I throwing things at you?
No, I think that's just me losing stuff off my chair. Okay. And then how much did you want to talk about the possibility of a retreat? And do you want to mention that at least?
So we can mention it, but I think that will include our new board members.
Agreed.
We're looking at a tentative board retreat, which would be, we've done this every year after an election, where it's a retreat, where it's a get to know you. Here's what policy governance looks like. Here's what being a board member responsibilities are, and a team building exercise. There are a couple options. We can either, and I'm talking mostly to you two gentlemen at this moment. We can either do it during the CASB winter session. They do host, several school boards host their board retreats during that session time, and they could facilitate that in a room for us, like down at the Broadmoor, which is where that event takes place. Or we can do our own somewhere else in December or January. I would personally, my preference is that we do it before our January board meeting, regular board meeting.
So for whatever it's worth, I concur we should do it before the holidays, especially for new members, so they have some time to do a little bit of studying, and then they can hit the ground running, so to speak.
Okay. Do
What-
either of you have a preference on whether we do it during the CASB event or whether we do it? No? Okay.
Is there, what do you think in terms of time commitment? 4 hours, 8 hours, half day, full day?
About 2 years.
That'll give me a chance to read the 2-syllable words, thank you.
Probably a few hours, I would anticipate.
Half day,
Yeah.
okay. Pretty flexible.
Do you have any preference on time?
I have a preference for a full day.
Okay.
I think it's hard to, we can talk more about that. I'm just telling you my 2 cents. So I will be flexible, but I worry that 4 hours may not be sufficient, and then we're sitting there looking at the need for another 4.
So if we do a full day, my preference would be to do it on our own, at our own location. Because it seems like what I've seen from the CASB ones is that they're 2 or 3 hour retreats, where they're mostly talking about policy matrix or things like that, but.
And maybe with that caveat, I guess it somewhat depends on interest and availability to attend CASB, because if there is that interest and availability, I think you could do a mini 2 to 3 hour and then follow that up with a 4 hour. So long as it has plenty of opportunity to dig in, so to speak, because there's just so much.
And we will have 2 other board members that will need to give input on
Yep.
this too, but I just wanted to start a preliminary discussion on it.
Lay the groundwork.
If we do a day, I'd ask that we consider a Friday, if that's okay.
Friday?
In December, is there a preference on that day?
Maybe not the last week leading up to Christmas. I think that's the 19th through the,
Are there any conflicts with the 8th or the 15th? Those would be the 2 Fridays that I think probably situate best.
yeah, 8th or 15th is good for me.
Okay, that actually
My
gives us some
gut says the
flexibility.
15th because that gives our newer board members an opportunity to be in a meeting.
Yep.
And you both can come as well if you'd like.
No, I think I'll turn the reins over to the new board.
There's the sitting section though,
That's
Mr.
right.
Clausen,
The gallery.
that can also turn into the standing section.
We'll get your box seats.
Mr. Schwartz, did either of those dates work okay for you?
It's already plugged in, sir.
All right, you're awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the order for the day? No? We are ending 5 minutes early.
Woo! Where's the confetti?
All right, well then we are adjourned.
Good work.
I was with an orthopedic surgeon all weekend. My friend that told me that in the last. They were here for his 40th reunion. Had him.
The 23rd.